The dog wouldn't move. That was the part nobody could explain afterward, not the pawnshop owner, not the people who'd been standing in line behind her, not even the man who held the leash. The German Shepherd had been calm the entire walk down Elgin Street, patient through 2 red lights and a slow revolving door, perfectly obedient the way only working dogs ever learn to be. And then Vivienne Audet laid 3 medals on the glass counter, and the dog pressed his body against her leg and sat down like he'd been asked to stay forever. Vivienne didn't notice at first. She was too busy trying to hold herself together. She'd spent 40 minutes in the parking garage before coming inside, sitting in her car with the engine off, telling herself this was practical. This was just a decision. People made decisions like this every day, and it didn't mean anything about who they were. The medals were in a shoebox on the passenger seat, wrapped in the same soft cloth her mother had used when she'd packed them away years ago. Vivienne had unwrapped them 3 times in the car, then wrapped them again. The Bronze Star, the Sacrifice Medal, and the Meritorious Service Medal, the one that still had the ribbon slightly frayed at the corner from when she'd pinned it on too quickly before a ceremony, nervous and 26, and not yet understanding what any of it would cost her. She was 31 now. She had $42 in her checking account, and her landlord had left a second notice under the door. The pawn shop was called Bridgman's, and it smelled like old electronics and carpet cleaner, and the man behind the counter had kind eyes and didn't ask her why. He just looked at the medals for a long moment, and then he said he'd need to look up current values, and Vivienne said that was fine, take your time, and that's when she felt the warmth against her left thigh and looked down. The dog was enormous, black and tan with a tactical vest and a focused, serious face that reminded her of the MPs she'd served alongside at CFB Gagetown. He had pressed himself sideways against her leg and was looking up at the medals on the counter with an expression she could only describe, later, as recognition. Boreal, heel. The voice came from behind her, low, unhurried, the particular kind of calm that comes from years of having to be the steadiest person in a room. She turned. The man was maybe 40, broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas jacket with a faded Canadian flag patch on the left sleeve. Not in uniform, but she knew immediately and without question what he was. "Sorry," he said, looking at his dog with something between apology and bewilderment. "He doesn't usually do that." Boreal had not moved. "It's all right," Vivienne said. She reached down slowly, the way she'd been taught to approach working dogs. Palm down, no sudden movements, and the shepherd turned his head and pressed his nose briefly into her hand. Not sniffing. Just contact. Like he was saying, "I know." She turned back to the counter so she didn't have to look at the man's face. She'd come back to Ottawa 8 months ago with a medical release and a folder full of paperwork she didn't fully understand yet. The Canadian Armed Forces didn't discharge you cleanly. They handed you a transition package and a caseworker with a caseload of 200 and told you to attend a seminar. The seminar was held in a beige room in a government building off Bronson Avenue, and the coffee was bad, and 3 of the 5 people in her group looked exactly the way she felt. Like they'd been handed the pieces of a life they no longer recognized and told to reassemble it without a diagram. She'd been a nursing officer, 7 years, 2 deployments, 1 to Latvia as part of Operation Reassurance, 1 to Mali, and then a field incident in her second tour that had left her with a left knee that didn't work the way it should and a sleep architecture so disrupted she could go 3 days without more than 2 hours at a stretch. The injury wasn't dramatic enough for people to easily understand. There was no visible wound. She limped slightly when she was tired, and she had dark circles under her eyes that concealer couldn't fully address. And sometimes, in the middle of a conversation, she would lose a word she'd known her entire life and have to reach for it in the space where it used to be. The VAC case manager she'd been assigned, a man named Faulkner, was not unkind. He was simply buried. She'd learned, slowly, that the difference between a claim being processed in 3 months versus 9 months versus never came down to whether you called enough, followed up enough, documented everything in writing and kept copies, pushed back gently on every delay without ever sounding difficult, because sounding difficult was the fastest way to make your file move backward instead of forward. Her nursing license was still valid. She'd tried twice to get work at the Ottawa hospital and once at Queensway Carleton. The first 2 calls didn't get returned. The third got as far as a phone interview before the hiring coordinator heard medical release, and the conversation changed in a way she couldn't quite articulate but absolutely felt. A shift in temperature, a slight withdrawal, the careful language of someone who had already decided. She had a bachelor's degree, 7 years of clinical and trauma nursing experience, 2 commendations, and a service record that had required her to maintain composure in conditions most people would not survive. And she could not get a callback from a hospital in her own city. She'd moved in with her aunt in Vanier for 4 months, and then she'd found a 1-bedroom in Lowertown that she could almost afford on the combination of a small VAC interim payment and the money she was slowly working through from her last military pay. She'd been meticulous about the math. She had a spreadsheet. She knew exactly how many months she had before the math stopped working. The month it stopped working, she went back to the spreadsheet and adjusted her assumptions, the way she'd been trained to do in the field: assess, adapt, find another way. She sold her car. She started taking the 12 bus. She canceled everything that wasn't the phone or the internet, because the internet was how you applied for jobs, and the phone was how they called you back if they called. They didn't often call. The month after that, she sat on her bathroom floor at 2 in the morning and thought very calmly about what she actually owned that had value. Her camera, which she'd bought in Riga with a month's pay during R&R. Her grandmother's ring, which she couldn't, and the medals in the shoebox on the high shelf in her closet, which she hadn't taken out since she'd packed up her quarters at Gagetown. She'd told herself, that night on the bathroom floor, that the medals were just objects, that what they represented didn't live in the metal, it lived what she'd done, and what she'd done couldn't be sold or pawned or taken. She believed this. She had to believe it. She got up off the floor and went back to bed, and in the morning she called VAC's toll-free number and waited 37 minutes on hold, and was then told that her file was under review. She waited 4 more months, and then she wrapped the medals in the soft cloth and put them in the shoebox and drove to Bridgman's on Elgin Street. The man's name was Sergeant Callum Dorr, though he said former sergeant with the slight emphasis people use when they're still sorting out what the word means to them now. He'd served 12 years with the Royal Canadian Regiment before a career change that had taken him sideways into security consulting. He told her this standing at the glass counter while his dog sat unmoving against her leg, and the pawnshop owner had quietly put her medals back on their cloth and stepped away to give them space in the manner of someone who understood that whatever was happening here was not his business. "You were CAF," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Nursing officer," she said. 7 years. He looked at the medals. She watched him read them the way military people read medals, not decoratively but informationally. Each one told a specific story if you knew the grammar. "Mali," he said. "Second tour." He was quiet for a moment. "You shouldn't need to be doing this." It was the most precisely correct thing anyone had said to her in 8 months, and it hit her somewhere undefended. She kept her face still. "The system has a different timeline than my landlord," she said. "What stage is your VAC file at?" She almost laughed. "Review. It's been at review since February." He pulled out his phone. "Do you have a caseworker?" "Faulkner. He's decent. There are a lot of files." "There's a veterans advocate at the Royal Canadian Legion on Bronson," he said. "Not the general intake. There's a woman named Tremblay. She used to work for Veterans Affairs directly. She knows exactly which forms can be expedited and under what conditions. She helped 3 guys from my old unit get their files unstuck." He was typing something, then he turned the phone toward her. It was a contact card. "Can I text this to you?" Vivienne stared at him. People didn't, in her experience, over these 8 months. People mostly didn't do this. They expressed sympathy. They said, "That's terrible, and the system is broken, and I don't know how you do it." They did not stand in pawn shops with working dogs and immediately produce specific, actionable information. "Yes," she said. "Please." He sent it. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. Boreal, at her left side, shifted slightly and settled again as if satisfied. "You should get your medals back," Callum said, nodding toward the cloth on the counter. "I need the money more than I need the medals." "I understand that. But I'd like to come back for them, if you'll let me. I have a colleague who works with Stiani's. They run a program for transition support, and there might be emergency funding you qualify for. Give me a week." She looked at him for a long moment. She had gotten very good in the past 8 months at identifying the difference between people who meant what they said and people who said things because it felt good to say them. She was not sure how she'd learned to tell the difference so quickly, only that she had, and that it had something to do with the quality of someone's attention, whether they were watching her while they spoke or watching themselves. Callum Dorr was watching her. "A week," she said. She put the medals back in the shoebox. Tremblay worked out of a small, cluttered office at the back of the Legion branch, behind the bar, and past the wall of regimental photographs. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, with the kind of efficient body language that suggested she'd learned years ago that there was more work than time, and the only answer was to move faster. She shook Vivienne's hand with a firmness that bordered on challenge and said, "Sit down and tell me what they've told you, and I'll tell you what they should have told you." Vivienne sat down and told her everything. Tremblay listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. She took notes in a narrow-ruled notebook with a green cover. When Vivienne finished, she was quiet for a moment, tapping the pen against the edge of the notebook. "Your file should not be at review," she said. "Given your service record and the nature of your injury, you qualify for priority processing under a provision that exists specifically to prevent situations like yours. Your caseworker should have flagged this. He may not have known, or he may not have had time to look." She said it without judgment, just stating a reality. "Here's what we're going to do." What they did, over the next 2 weeks, involved a stack of forms that Vivienne had never seen before, a formal request for priority reassessment, and 2 phone calls that Tremblay made while Vivienne sat across the desk and watched a woman who knew exactly how to navigate a system turn its own rules against its own inertia. Tremblay spoke to VAC's staff with a specific and undecorated fluency, citing provision numbers, using names, following up in writing within the hour. She was not unkind. She was simply impossible to lose in a pile. Vivienne's file moved from review to processing in 11 days. Callum had been right about Stian's. There was an emergency transitional support fund for medically released veterans in financial hardship, administered quietly and without ceremony, and Vivienne qualified. The amount wasn't transformative. It covered 3 months of rent and enough breathing room that she stopped doing the math every morning before she got out of bed. 3 months, she'd calculated, was enough time. She used the time the way she'd used every difficult stretch of her life, methodically. She went back to the hospital contacts, but this time with a letter of support from the Legion and a specific referral from a nursing supervisor at Stian's, who had, it turned out, trained at the same program as the director of nursing at Queensway Carleton. The letter was 2 paragraphs. It mentioned Vivienne's deployment record, her clinical commendation, and her transition status directly, without softening. She got a call back in 4 days. The interview was at 9 in the morning, and she took the 12 bus and arrived 12 minutes early and sat in the lobby reading the same paragraph of a magazine article 3 times without absorbing it. She knew her file. She knew her experience. She had answered interview questions in military debriefs that were more consequential than anything they could ask her here, and she had answered them under conditions that would have rendered most people speechless. She reminded herself of this on the bus. She reminded herself of it in the lobby. She reminded herself of it when the director of nursing, a woman named Okafor, walked out to meet her and shook her hand and said, "I understand you've done 2 deployments, Latvia and Mali," with the tone of someone who'd actually read the file. "Yes," Vivienne said. "We're short 4 nurses on evenings," Okafor said. "Come back to my office and let's talk about what that might look like." They talked for an hour. Vivienne's knee held through the interview. She took the bus home and got off 1 stop early and walked through the Byward Market slowly, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to feel the city around her for a minute. The October cold, the smell of the river nearby, the sound of someone playing guitar badly outside a coffee shop on George Street. She'd grown up 40 minutes east, in a house outside Embrun where her parents still lived, and Ottawa had always felt to her like the city she'd been heading toward, serious and slightly underestimated, good at quiet things. She'd been so determined to belong to it before she enlisted, and then she'd left, and now she was trying to come back to it piece by piece, like someone reassembling something that had been taken apart in a hurry. She got the job. On a Saturday in November, she met Callum and Boreal at the coffee shop on Bank Street they'd settled on as neutral ground, and she brought the Bronze Star in her jacket pocket. She'd thought about what to say for most of the previous week, and had decided to simply say it. "I want to give you this," she said, putting it on the table between them. "Not to keep, just, you should know what you'll protect." He looked at it. He didn't pick it up. "You earned that." "I know I did, that's why I'm showing it to you." She put it back in her pocket. "You and Tremblay and whoever connected you to Stiana's, that's a chain of people who didn't have to do anything, and they did. That's not as rare as it feels right now," he said. "You just caught it at the wrong angle for 8 months, 9 by the end." She wrapped her hands around her coffee. Boreal was under the table, his head resting on her left boot, which had become, over the past several weeks, his established preference. The first time he'd done it, she'd sat very still, suddenly and unexpectedly unable to speak. She was better at it now. "My first shift is Monday." He smiled. It changed his face considerably. "What unit? Evening medicine. Queensway. Good hospital." "I think so." She looked out at Bank Street, at the people moving past in their winter coats, the October light going cold and flat the way it did in Ottawa before the snow. "I almost didn't go into Bridgman's that day. I sat in the car for 40 minutes. I know. I saw you come in." He turned his coffee cup. "Boreal wouldn't settle when we walked past your car. I thought he'd picked up something. I didn't know what." She thought about the dog sitting against her leg in the pawn shop, the warmth of him, the specific solidity of it, the way it had felt, in a moment when she was trying very hard to feel nothing, like being told you don't have to do this alone. "He's a very good dog," she said. Boreal's tail moved once under the table, unhurried, like he already knew. The VAC file resolved in full by December. The back payment arrived in 2 deposits, and Vivienne sat at the kitchen table of her Lowertown apartment and looked at the number on her phone screen for a long time. It was not a windfall. It was not enough to undo what the previous year had cost her, but it was hers and it was right, and those two things had not always been the same thing. She called her mother that night. Her mother, who had said nothing practical when Vivienne first told her about the situation because there was nothing practical to say, and who had simply replied, "The way she always had, then we'll figure it out, Viv," which was its own kind of courage, when you thought about it. The refusal to be undone by what you couldn't yet solve. Vivienne's knee still hurt when she stood too long. She still had nights when the sleep came in pieces, and she woke at 3 and lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the buildings settling around her. She had learned, slowly, to find those hours useful instead of frightening, to use them for the planning and the reading and the careful quiet thinking that she'd always been better at than she gave herself credit for. She had a job. She had her file resolved. She had a veteran's advocate she could call, and a dog who seemed to consider her left boot his personal resting place, and a former sergeant who had stood in a pawn shop and immediately done the most useful thing anyone had done for her in 9 months, which was to look at what was actually wrong and address it without waiting to be asked. She still had the medals. All 3 of them, back on the high shelf in the shoebox, next to the soft cloth her mother had packed around them. She hadn't decided yet what she'd do with them eventually. Frame them, maybe. Put them somewhere she'd see them, instead of somewhere she wouldn't have to look. It seemed like it might be time for that,